Welcome to today's edition of The World Today on U.S. China relations in the Biden administration. We are absolutely delighted to be partnering on this event with the Penn Project on the future of U.S. China relations, which is sponsored by the Center for the Study of Contemporary China, with support from the Penn Global China Research and Education Fund and the Henry Luce Foundation. I'll now introduce our panelists and then cede the virtual stage to our moderator. Our first panelist is Shana Chestnut-Greitens, an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where she's also affiliated with both the Strauss Center and the Clements Center for National Security. She's a non-resident senior fellow with the Brookings Institution in Washington, and her research focuses on security, East Asia, and authoritarian politics and foreign policy. Dr. Greitens' work on China and North Korea has appeared in academic journals and edited volumes in English, Chinese, and Korean, as well as in major media outlets. She's previously testified to Congress on security issues in the Indo-Pacific. Her first book, Dictators and Their Secret Police, received several academic awards, and she's currently working on two main research projects, one on China's internal security policies and their implications for China and the world, and another on authoritarian diasporas, particularly focused on North Korea. She holds a doctorate from Harvard, a master's of philosophy from Oxford University, where she studied as a Marshall Scholar, and a bachelor's from Stanford University. Ryan Haas is a senior fellow and the Michael H. Armacost Chair in Foreign Policy at Brookings. He's also the interim Chen Fu and Cecilia Yen Ku Chair in Taiwan Studies at Brookings and a non-resident affiliated fellow in the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale Law School. From 2013 to 2017, Haas served as the director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the National Security Council. And in that role, he advised President Obama and senior White House officials on all aspects of U.S. policy towards China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, and coordinated the implementation of U.S. policy among U.S. government departments and agencies. Prior to the NSC, Haas served as a foreign service officer in the U.S. Embassy in both Beijing and Seoul, and domestically in the State Department Office of Taiwan Coordination and Korean Affairs. He's the author of Stronger, Adapting America's China Strategy in an Age of Competitive Interdependence. Nason Mabubi is a research scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a lecturer in the law school at Penn Law School. He also hosts the CSCC podcast. His primary academic interests are in the areas of administrative law, comparative law, and Chinese law, and his current writing focuses on the development of modern Chinese administrative law. He's chaired the International Committee of the ABA section of Administrative Law and Regulatory Practice, has advised both the Asia Foundation and the Administrative Conference of the United States on Chinese Administrative Procedural Reform, and he moderates the Comparative Administrative Law listserv hosted by Yale Law School. He's taught at Princeton University, the University of Connecticut, and Yale Law School. He holds a JD from Columbia Law School and an AB in politics from Princeton University. Our moderator today is Susan A. Thornton, a retired senior U.S. diplomat with almost 30 years of experience in the State Department in Eurasia and East Asia. She's currently a senior fellow and research scholar at Yale University Law School and the director of the Forum on Asia-Pacific Security at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. Until July 2018, Thornton was acting assistant secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the Department of State and led East Asia policymaking amid crises with North Korea, escalating trade tensions with China, and a fast-changing international environment. In previous State Department roles, she worked on U.S. policy towards China, Korea, and the former Soviet Union, and served in leadership positions at U.S. embassies in Central Asia, Russia, the Caucasus, and China. Thornton received her MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins and her BA from Bowdoin College in Economics and Russian. She serves on several nonprofit boards, speaks Mandarin and Russian, and lives on an organic farm in Lisbon, Maine. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us here today to talk about the future of U.S.-China relations. And I'll now hand this over to our moderator and look forward to the discussion. Thank you all.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. And it's great to be with all of you today. And I just want to mention at the top that all of the participants here today were actively engaged in the Future of U.S.-China Relations project at the Penn Center for the Study of Contemporary China. And I myself was privileged to be part of that. I wasn't young enough to be part of the young scholars that were involved, but I was a mentor, and I really enjoyed that experience. And I'm happy to reconnect with several of the participants in that project here today. We have a lot of things to talk about and a short amount of time to do it in. So let's dig right into U.S. China relations this morning. First off, I want to set the stage a little bit and put U.S. China relations in context, because there's certainly a lot of change and ferment in the world, and there's a lot going on as far as the political transition here in the U.S. So I think we all can acknowledge that many countries in the world, and also the US at the moment, are facing serious challenges from COVID-19, but also in the perspective of economic recovery and a lot of other shifts that are taking place. So I'd love to get your perspective, Sheena, Nathan, and Ryan, on sort of where China policy sits in the new administration's priority list. And in particular, what is the level of attention you think the administration is paying to the set of issues that you've been writing on or about in connection with your work on the sort of U.S. China futures project that you set out earlier? And maybe we can go first to you, Sheena, for your thoughts on sort of the context of U.S. China relations currently from the U.S. administration's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much to everybody involved for organizing this conversation today. It's a pleasure to be with you. And it's been a pleasure to be part of this project on the future of U.S. China relations. I think that the U.S. China relationship is an incredibly consequential bilateral relationship. It's clearly, I think, at the top or one of the top several issues that the Biden administration is looking at in terms of foreign policy and national security. There is always the task that presidents have of trying to juggle foreign policy concerns with domestic priorities. But in this case, just as a scene-setting comment, it seems that China policy has received a pretty high level of attention from the administration. It's been a really important theme. And more importantly, that this administration really seems to see a connection between some of the tasks of domestic policy, domestic revitalization, recovery, renewal, and their foreign policy work, particularly on the U.S. China relationship. So that's sort of my general take on where this sits. I'm sure that Ryan and Nathan will have additional comments on that. But as it relates to surveillance technology and emerging technology, which I focused on for the PEN project, I think, again, this is an area where there have been a lot of very quickly moving developments coming into the Biden administration. And one of the things that they did was to establish a senior directorate at the National Security Council for emerging technology. And so I think we're seeing those issues get some senior attention. Tech plays a pretty central role in U.S.-China competition right now. I think the senior directorate is designed to reflect that, and also to try to make sure that the interagency is better coordinated on an issue that kind of has been dealt with individually by different departments, but where there's really a need for the administration to craft a coherent strategy. So that's my overall take on the landscape.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. And that's an excellent segue, the way you left it there, forging a coherent strategy, from all of these departments. I would love to turn now to Ryan, since you actually worked in the NSC, albeit under a different administration, but you also worked with then Vice President Biden. How do you see sort of China policy in, you've been there seeing the sausage made, so to speak. How do you see China sort of sitting among all of the different priorities and issues that the president is faced with, and certainly in the context too of a pretty pressing domestic agenda that he's certainly been focusing on and working on? Love to get your thoughts, Ryan.
Well, I will just try to briefly build upon what Sheena has said, because I largely agree with it. And thank you for recalling our experience together when I was at the NSC. I was very fortunate to have the best partner in the world in Susan Thornton at the State Department. So it was a fun experience. My sense is that the Biden administration views China as the top nation state competitor of the United States, but not necessarily the only challenge that the United States confronts. Secretary Blinken gave a speech a month or so ago at the State Department where he identified 8 top priorities of U.S. foreign policy. Please don't test me on what those 8 were because I haven't committed them to memory yet, but they are things like COVID, climate, immigration, alliances, technology, and the like. And I think that this is an important framing construct because it shows that the United States will place emphasis on the importance of the relationship with China, but it will not allow China to eclipse the other priorities and responsibilities that the United States has in the world. China is a challenger for the United States. It is the only country in the world that has, a major economy, major population, global ambitions, and major military. It is the only country in the world that challenges the United States in multiple regions of the world simultaneously, and probably the first country to do that since the end of the Cold War. So I don't mean to diminish the challenge that China poses, merely to emphasize that I think the Biden administration has it about right in terms of identifying China as a major challenge, but not allowing it to override all the other balls that they must juggle simultaneously.
Okay, great. That's excellent. Thank you for putting it in that context. And I think in that speech that you mentioned, Ryan, that Tony Blinken gave at the State Department, it was all about this foreign policy for the middle class. So let's keep that in our rearview mirror as we go forward on the next question. And since we have limited time for questions, I want to get through. I won't hit everyone on every question because we want to take questions certainly from the audience here in a few minutes. But Nason, maybe you could start us off on the next one. Richard Haass, who's the president, of course, of the Council on Foreign Relations, said that the change in U.S. policy toward China in recent years, and he's talking about, I guess, over the last 5 years or so, is the fastest 180-degree on a major change on a major foreign policy issue that he's seen in his lifetime. And I wonder if you, if we take that as a given because he said it and he's got a certain perspective, I mean, how do you explain that the rapid change in the landscape in recent years, and with particular attention to the issues you've been thinking that have come up in the context of the Futures Project on U.S. China relations? How do you explain? Is it China? Is it the U.S.? Is it the world? How do you see it?
Thanks, Susan. And so nice to be with all of you again here this morning. Of course, I have enormous respect for Richard Haass for his longtime government service and now in his role at the Council on Foreign Relations. I do tend to think that some of that framing can be overstated. I think we clearly are seeing a different relationship between the US and China that we had experienced before for much of the past 40 years since normalization of relations. But I tend to be a little bit more sanguine about how fraught things really are right now, especially given the change in administration and the lowering of some of the rhetorical temperature that we had seen in the past year, especially. And even if you look at sort of the Trump administration, I think there's a big change from January 15th, 2020, when the phase 1 trade agreement was announced, the dynamics of the rhetoric around the relationship going through the end of the Trump administration. Of course, COVID played a big role in that story. And I think because of the larger landscape of COVID, there was also a lot of space for different aspects of the Trump administration to use more confrontational rhetoric vis-a-vis China. But I'm not sure that I personally think it has fundamentally changed the relationship that much. At the end of the day, what seems to me to still be the case is that the US and China are the world's 2 largest economies, and both have a great deal of interest that are independent of each other, but they both share it in a degree of global stability across many different vectors, including financial, including vis-a-vis different kinds of threats, whether posed by different kinds of regimes, and of course have shared interests on matters like climate change, public health. And to me, that is still the more dominant story, notwithstanding a lot of the, ups and downs in the rhetoric between the two countries over the past year and a half.
Well, thanks very much, Nathan. So you get at one issue here, which seems to be pretty fundamental to a lot of people's thinking about China, which is the dichotomy between sort of the need for kind of an ability to work with China on kind of global and transnational issues, which have certainly dominated in a way the news cycles for the last, especially year, but even prior to that with the Great War on Terrorism and all of these other things, and the major power competition that Ryan talked about, which sort of frames the relationship with China in this kind of bipolar kind of way. And I wondered, Sheena, what's your thinking on this? How do you see it? I mean, there was this, pretty sort of big shift, I think, on the part of people who are now in government, actually, and who were in the Biden administration around this article that came out about, the fact that engagement with China had failed. And that was sort of, coming around to bring a lot of the people who had staffed the Obama administration toward what the Trump administration was at that point doing in the middle of their term, which was, this much more confrontational approach to China in a much more zero-sum kind of way. How do you see the sort of the developments here and the change in China policy in the U.S.?
Yeah, I probably have some friendly disagreement with Nathan on a bit of this, although it's more a matter of degree than kind of type. I also agree that a 180 is probably a little bit of an overstatement, but I see it as a pretty swift recalibration. And I think that recalibration has extended across party lines. I think some of it is bipartisan. And so, acknowledging that there is exactly this dichotomy to China policy that you identify, that there are some areas where it's in the U.S. interest and in the interest of the world at large for the U.S. and China to find collaborative solutions and to cooperate. I think there has been a shift toward more competitive elements and areas of the relationship where there's more disagreement. The economic relationship used to be something that propelled deeper engagement in the U.S. China relationship, and it's now one of the forces that's impelling or propelling the countries further apart. Often, in my view, if you look at trade policy and economic competitiveness. But the other factor that I think it's really important to consider is that the period in which this recalibration is occurring has also seen some pretty dramatic changes in China's own behavior. And if you look at what happened, the difference between when Vice President Biden left office and when he returned to the White House as president, I think there are some areas of the world that look very, very different. We did not have mass detention facilities and collective forced re-education in Xinjiang. Hong Kong was in a very, very different place in 2015, 2016 than it is today. There's been a different level of economic and political pressure applied to Taiwan, even though that's always been fraught, as you and Ryan both probably know better than I do. But there are these areas, there's a much more open level of border conflict on the India-China border. And so there are these areas where I think China's domestic security policies and its foreign security policies and some of its foreign economic policies as well have changed. And I think some of the recalibration that we're seeing was both within the Trump administration, but part of the reason we're not seeing the Biden administration pick up where Biden left off as vice president is that the world is different now and Chinese behavior is different now. And so I see a lot, it's hard for me to talk about the recalibration that's occurred without really looking at which facets of China's behavior have changed in the last 5 to 10 years.
Okay, so you would put the change more at the feet of changes in China's behavior. I wonder, Sheena, if you see anything that the U.S. has been doing that would have brought about this change.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there have been a lot of places where the United States, the relationship has become more tense or more fraught. Certainly, the way that the Trump administration handled conflicts over trade and economic competition, once some of those interactive dynamics are set in play, I think we see a lot of the dynamics that get started that are then sort of locked in and difficult to reverse. Similarly, the sort of handling of the coronavirus, some of the rhetoric that Nason mentioned about the responsibility for the coronavirus, some of the racially tinged rhetoric and accusations that the Trump administration made, and that Trump personally in some cases made. I think, all of that, there are areas where the United States probably contributed to that accelerating dynamic. Again, it's sort of a question of, in an interactive dynamic, it's always a question of, then you go back to what China was doing and how much of that was a response to the US. But I also see some of the CCP's behavior that's raised concern as driven more by internal security dynamics and party security dynamics than necessarily solely by the US bilateral relationship. And I guess one of my cautions would be, it's important to look at our role, but it's also important to remember that there are things about China's behavior that are not all about us as the United States. And so I always try to sort of make sure we strike the right balance on assessing our role in driving Chinese behavior, and remember that some of it's not coming from things that we do or say. But I guess the other thing is, just thinking about that rebalancing and the implications for the US's own domestic policy, right? I think the Biden administration has a very particular view on that, on what the US's responsibilities and roles are. And so that's where I think we probably see some of the biggest areas of difference. But rather than have me talk about that, I'd much rather hear what Ryan has to say, because he's got this whole book on, how to make America stronger and more competitive. So I'm kind of trying to stay away from that, knowing that he has much more informed and thoughtful things to say.
No, perfect. You're making the moderator's job so easy. You guys are just leading me right into the next question. But I want to just follow up. That's a really important point that you made about seeing everything that China does through the lens of the US and thinking that everything they're doing is because of things that we're doing, or it's about us. And as a former diplomat, I just have to say that I couldn't agree more that this point is so important, and it's so often overlooked, especially in media narratives. I think in the US, most countries formulate domestic policies based on their own domestic considerations, and it has almost nothing to do with external factors, including the United States. So thank you for bringing up that point. It's really important. So I'm just scrolling through some of the questions, and a lot of these questions are about things like how to balance, what are we competing over, are we misunderstanding one another, etc. But before we get to the audience questions, I just want to give you all a chance to sort of look at how things have gone so far with the Biden administration in China, and to sort of give your advice, as Sheena mentioned, Ryan does in his book, and how you see things sort of spinning out in the sort of near to medium term. I mean, how are we doing so far? Where are we at the moment? We've had the phone call between the two presidents. We've had the meeting in Alaska between the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State with their Chinese counterparts. And we've had John Kerry meeting in Shanghai with his counterpart on climate change. And we have a summit coming up in 2 days that President Biden is hosting, that President Xi, I guess, may or may not come to. But how do you think things are going, and where would you like to see some adjustments, and what kinds of things do you think are important for consideration in the future as far as policy, outcomes or policy moves? And Ryan, maybe we'll go to you.
Well, you've put a lot of big questions on the table. I will try to pick up one or two and then hand the baton off to my friends Sheena and Nason to carry it forward. But I think that we are sort of settling into a new normal in the U.S.-China relationship. The sort of harshly adversarial antagonism seems to have worn down a little bit, and we're settling into this sort of hardening competition that I think is going to be with us for a while in the U.S.-China relationship, where both sides are looking for their friends as a bulwark against the challenge that they feel from the other. So you see the United States trying to pull Japan closer, pull our Quad partners, India, Australia, Japan, and the United States together, pull closer with the European Union. And China is in the background of a lot of these efforts, if not the foreground, really animating this push. And there's also, at the same time, a real effort to try to strengthen ourselves at home. President Biden is talking about investing in ourselves through infrastructure, in part so that we can continue to outpace and outcompete China. And the same is happening in reverse. There's a mirroring effect that appears to be going on. It was not lost on any of us, I don't think, that after the Anchorage meeting, Secretary Blinken traveled to Brussels and Foreign Minister Wang Yi hosted his closest confidant on the world stage, Foreign Minister Lavrov, inside China. And then Foreign Minister Wang traveled to the Middle East, where he went to countries that feel disaffected by the United States and tried to pull them closer to China. So both countries are taking steps in parallel to each other. China also is trying to advance this policy of dual circulation, which is described as an economic way of trying to offset the hostile forces that China feels from the outside. China is trying to invest in accelerating technology self-sufficiency, in part to reduce dependence on the United States and the need to purchase inputs from the United States. So both countries are traveling pretty rapidly down these parallel paths. And I don't see what is going to sort of serve as a break or a deviation from that, at least in the near term. But I would also caution against overstating the point, because I do think that there have been shifts that have been made by the Biden administration. They're subtle, but I think that they're significant. The rhetorical heat has been dialed down, as we've talked about recently. There isn't talk right now amongst US government officials about regime change or separating the Chinese Communist Party from the Chinese people or demonizing the Chinese Communist Party. There is a pretty disciplined effort by President Biden to refer to China as a competitor and not as an adversary or enemy. And this matters because a competitor is someone that you try to outpace, and an adversary or an enemy is someone who you feel the need to harm in order to protect yourself. Both leaders have acknowledged the need to cooperate even amidst competition. And related to that, there have been gradual, steady efforts to rebuild diplomatic channels of communication around some of these issues, whether it was former Secretary Kerry's trip to China last week to talk about climate issues, or some of the work that is underway around Afghanistan or Iran. So these are changes that don't grab headlines, but I think over time, as we look back, will be seen as significant.
Terrific, thanks. Sheena, how about you? How do you see sort of the moves, the opening moves of the Biden administration here, and how? I guess another question would be sort of how would China see these moves, and where do they think this is going? I mean, Ryan talked about the new normal, and it does, sound in practice. I mean, I can't count the number of articles I've read about, yes, there's a new Cold War, no, there's not a new Cold War, but it certainly kind of feels a little bit like the prelude. And people like Henry Kissinger, who have thoughts on such subjects, have said that we're in the foothills or on the mountain or something. I mean, is it the end of kind of globalization? Are we turning back towards something that was familiar to some of us who are of a certain age in our youth? Or, is there a way, as Ryan said, that this can be turned into a kind of a healthy competition and not sort of going back toward containment or trying to keep, China from accomplishing its goals? What do you think?
Well, certainly, I think there's been a bit more continuity between some of the policies of the Trump administration and the Biden administration than I might have anticipated, particularly as it relates to tech, which is the area that I focused on for the Penn project. And so in that case, we've seen, fair amount of high level attention, some continuity in terms of letting some of the executive orders or policy decisions that were made in the last days of the Trump administration carry through. And I think that's a recognition of the role that technology does play in that competition. And I think Ryan is entirely right that it's healthier for the United States to think about a competition that advances our own interests rather than doing things for the sake of harming China, right? The point is to move the United States further ahead in pursuit of its interests, not to do something on China for China's sake. What I think is actually really interesting, and I guess the area that I'll add to, which is not a disagreement with anything that Ryan's just said, but kind of a slightly different point about where this could go and how it might register in China, is the emphasis on democracy in the Biden administration, not just as a value to be defended or used to guide foreign policy, but as a strategic asset to leverage, right? And that language is, I think, a little bit different. It's, again, there's been a long emphasis. I don't want to overstate the degree to which this is a difference or original to this administration. I don't think it is. But this idea of democracy as a strategic asset to be deployed in competition does strike me as sort of an adjustment to the way that we might have thought about or talked about democracy before. I think this is it's a pretty long-standing personal commitment of Biden's and of the people who are around him in the administration. I work some on North Korea, and he played a pretty significant role in the passage of the North Korea Human Rights Act back when he was a senator. So again, I think this is a pretty core sort of commitment. What I think is interesting about this is that it raises two key questions for American policy. The first of those is, how is the United States then going to work with partners who are either non-democratic, flawed democracies, or not interested in orienting their foreign policy around this concept of a democratic foreign policy as the orienting principle, right? I can think of alliance partners we have in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's Thailand or the Philippines, where democracy is very limited or troubled. Or if you think about the relationship with India, where there have been recent concerns raised by some of these global institutes and think tanks that track global democracy, or even an ally like South Korea, which is itself a democracy and a democratic partner, but is maybe less willing to trade off other national interests in order to make statements about the normative importance of democracy. Right? South Korea has been, more limited in the extent to which the Moon administration will sign up for, say, UN criticisms of North Korea on human rights grounds. And so the question is, how do you form coalitions at a practical level? Dropping down from this big paradigm at a practical level, then what trade-offs are you willing to make to build these more practical coalitions that are kind of the day-to-day work the Biden administration will have to do on individual issues? And I think they'll probably end up with overlapping coalitions that are more issue-based and a little bit more pragmatic, but I do think it's an important area to think about going forward. I guess the other thing to think about is the question that you raised, and sorry, you put a lot on the table. I'll try to keep this really short. But this question of how this will land in China. And I think we're seeing some nervousness. There was an article that came out late last year talking about, should we be concerned about it, from a Chinese scholar talking about, should we be concerned about an ideological security dilemma? And I think we have to be a little bit attentive in our bilateral communication to this idea that things that we perceive as defensive on our end, right, defending and strengthening democracy here at home or with like-minded partners around the world, could be perceived in China as offensive. And that there's already an ideological framework, particularly, with the renewed emphasis on ideology under Xi Jinping, that might be more prone to perceiving things as offensive when we think of them as defensive. That doesn't mean the U.S. should back off of its own normative values and its own efforts to defend and strengthen democracy. But I think understanding that there's an interactive element there, and then therefore being good at predicting what the Chinese response will be, is going to be important. I don't have a clear sense of how that's actually going to play out, but that's the framing question, I guess, that I have, which is kind of this more specific piece of how is this going to land in China? How do I expect that framing to interact with what we're seeing in terms of ideological constructs and the renewed emphasis on ideological security on the Chinese side? I think it's an area that really bears watching.
Thank you so much for those comments. Really important. And I think that, Biden has mentioned this several times now, the notion that he has of framing his foreign policy in terms of democracies versus autocracies. And it seems to be a big part also of his sort of domestic push, that we have to show that democracy can deliver results to people, I think is what he keeps saying. And I think you raise the point that how this lands overseas. I mean, the US comes with a certain amount of baggage on democracy promotion, especially recently, right, in the unipolar era. And I think it's not totally clear, certainly to China and probably to a lot of other countries yet, exactly how this, how the balance. And I was watching a presentation by a European official recently who talked about the need to balance between values and interests. And of course, that is the same thing that we're all going to have to be trying to find, is the balance there. And that leads me into one of the first questions that we have from the audience. And I'll put a couple of them together here because you touched already on these issues a little bit, Sheena, but I want to go to Nason. And the question is sort of, what are we competing over, and what does success look like? How do we measure success? And then again, what is the role that US allies, and maybe because you mentioned, Sheena, not just allies, but other partners that, may not be our closest democratic allies and partners. What is their role in all of this? So Nason, why don't we go to you for this very simple question about what are we competing over and how do we measure success? I think this is a key question for us to have a clear answer for the American public on.
I do think it's a deceptively simple question. There's different ways that one could try to answer that. And, one way could be the way that it might be answered in certain think tanks in Beijing, which is that we're competing over, global preeminence, hegemony. Xi Jinping gave a speech yesterday, which was sort of somewhat obliquely criticizing the US for trying to act like a hegemon and suggesting that, China was representing countries which are taking a different approach to global order. Of course, we would view that discussion differently. Another way of describing it is in the way that we've been talking about so far, the difference between democratic approaches to certain types of global public goods issues versus maybe more authoritarian approaches. And, we could see that especially acutely in the area of technology. So I think it's actually quite a hard question to answer. And so much of our own thinking about China here in the US, I think, can't be divorced from our own thinking about ourselves. Thinking about where we stand as a nation in sort of the global stage, how we stand as individuals within this nation. There are many things that maybe get ascribed to the competition with China that actually have a very attenuated relationship with the actual China, and is more us projecting sort of an other that we can measure ourselves against, whether it's as individuals or as a nation. So I hope my answer so far has indicated how complex I actually think this question really is. And so then you ask me, well, what are the metrics for success? Given that complexity, that's an even harder question to answer. But one would think that any metrics for success, above all, whether you're thinking about this from a US standpoint, from a Chinese standpoint, are most of all have to do with your own domestic situation, your own domestic stability, your own domestic economic growth, the kind of opportunities you offer to your own domestic citizens. Above all, is the metrics for success for any administration, whether US or Chinese.
Great. Let me turn, Ryan, to you for an answer to this very, simple question. Sort of what does success look like? What would be a good outcome here if you could master the world and have your preferred future where all U.S. policy moves, resulted in their desired effect, and we could see our way to your future? What would a good future look like in the Asia Pacific as far as the U.S. is concerned, and with China as far as the U.S. is concerned and its allies?
Well, Susan, it's a critical question, and I'm glad we're spending some time grappling with it. My view, and I may place myself in the minority here, but my view is that the United States doesn't get to choose China's regime type, whether we like it or not. We don't get to choose the size of China's economy. American policymakers will not determine what China's GDP will be. We don't get to choose whether or not China falls back within its borders or extends its influence abroad. We do get to control our own behavior, and that's where I would like to see us invest a lot more of our energy and focus. To the extent that that our China strategy is a component of our overall global strategy, my suggestion would be that the focus should be on trying to influence China's behavior. With China's 1.4 billion citizens, its proud history, its geographic location at the heart of Asia, the most dynamic region in the world, China is going to be a force on the world stage for the course of our lifetimes. That's just, I think, a observable fact and reality. So the more that we can work with other allies and partners to try to channel China's energy, its influence, its activism into directions that do not instigate conflict with us, and hopefully that help relieve a bit of burden upon the United States for dealing with global challenges, I think that will put us and them in a healthier position, and hopefully will allow both countries to coexist amidst what I expect will be pretty intense competition.
And Sheena, maybe because this is such an important question, I'd like to get everyone having a chance to give a thought. I mean, and there's been a lot also written about sort of the structural transition going on in the world, which you can't ignore either, right? I mean, we had after the collapse of the Soviet Union, 30 years, let's say, of a unipolar world in which the US was clearly so dominant on the world stage. And, many people have written that this is, bound to change and is changing, or maybe even has changed. And gives rise maybe to some of the sensibilities in the United States that Nason was referring to. So how does that maybe impact kind of the competition and the how this is going to go in the future, and what is the role here of sort of the international system, which so many countries that are our allies and otherwise have a big stake in, versus this kind of major power strategic interaction that we're seeing? I mean, how do you see that sort of playing out, and what should we do best to manage the balance there, not just the balance between values and interests, but the balance between, the international system and rules versus, just flat out major power struggles?
I see this very much as an area where the United States does have a lot of positive work it could do, where I think things that advance the interests of the United States are very much things that are compatible with a global framework that would be attractive to a lot of countries. And again, I'm thinking of this particularly through the lens of technology and the areas that I focus on. But I think, there are places where global surveillance technology in particular is very poorly regulated right now. That's true domestically, and it's true at the international level, simply because the technology has, as has happened with a lot of previous technological innovations, right? The technology develops before we have the legal tools or the policy frameworks to understand what the trade-offs are and be able to weight them appropriately. So there often is this policy and regulatory lag with technology, and thinking about how we put policies around its use to make sure that they play a positive role. So on that front, I think this is an area where the United States does have a real potential leadership role to play, but it'll be leadership that's most effective if it's exercised in partnership and cooperation with other like-minded countries, most of whom I think will be democracies or aspiring democracies. You don't have to be a perfect member of the Democratic Club, I think, to play a constructive role, and that's true for the United States as it is for other countries around the world. That's just reality. But I think, in this area, the United States I think, has been a little bit behind in terms of its own sort of organization of an interagency process on technology, and then especially engaging with rule-setting bodies and the international frameworks that could regulate technology, particularly surveillance technology, to make sure that we try to make its use and its domestic and international growth in the use of this technology as compatible with democracy and human rights and freedom as possible. And I do think the United States has a really important voice and important leadership and sort of convening role to play on those discussions. I was glad to see that emerging tech was one of the working areas emphasized by the Quad. I was glad to see the US put forward a candidate for leadership at the ITU. Again, I endorse Ryan's point. There's a lot we don't control about the world we live in. We don't control exactly what China is going to do. We don't control what, even our allies and friends do around the world. And much of that, to your point earlier, is driven by their domestic calculations and interests. But there are these areas where I think the United States can talk with like-minded countries, come up with a useful, proactive way of trying to set international norms and standards that we and a large number of countries can agree on are a positive thing. Some of that may put us in tension with China, right? We probably don't seem to have the same vision on data privacy and data security and surveillance technology that China does. I'm okay with that being an area where we have some pretty distinct differences. But again, knowing that we can't control or change China's approach, I would like to see us put forward a really robust and attractive alternative. And so that's where I hope and would like to see a lot of the emphasis placed in the months and the couple of years ahead.
Thank you. It's just so interesting. And this is a really important point about how the US can't control everything that happens on the world stage or in China. I mean, it certainly does seem, though, if you're in the hot seat in the administration dealing with China policy, that there's a lot of people out there coming off 30 years of unipolarity that expect you to be able to control an awful lot. And I wonder if there isn't a role here somehow about managing expectations of people in the transition in the global order, about that the US can't control everything. But I do want to we have time probably for one more question. There's so many good questions from the audience, and I'm going to try to meld a bunch of them together in this one question, which is also going to be, of course, really easy to answer. Which, there's questions about sort of our economic relationship with China, the issues about sanctions in Xinjiang and what it's done to, the textile industry, et cetera. The fact that China is such a major economic player with so many 125 countries counted as their number one trading partner. And then there's a question about human rights. How can we balance security concerns and human rights concerns? So I guess what I would try to put all that together into one question. It used to be the case that in relations with China that are clearly very complicated and multifaceted, we would try to keep issues in their own lane. So John Kerry's talked about this with climate change, that we need to work on climate change in a climate change only lane and not have it bleed over. We need to work on our trade issues with a lane there and have negotiations on trade and try not to let it be derailed by other things. But it seems like now recently things have sort of bled all into each other. And this is not just happening, I think, with China, but it's happening sort of more broadly in the world as the global system comes under pressure. But certainly on China, it's the most clear place where these things happen. How should we be balancing and this gets back to the issue that we mentioned earlier that my European colleague also mentioned, balancing values and interests. How can we best do this? And, how should people think about the prioritization here? And again, in managing expectations and making, the obvious point that the US can't control everything, but what do we have the best chance in making progress on, and how do we do that in balancing these different issues? And Nason, maybe I'll come first to you for your perspective on this.
Sure. And, of course, I completely agree that there's this massive landscape of different issues that in some ways would be helpfully segmented from one another so that you can make progress in areas where you can make progress, you can confront on areas where you need to confront in Secretary Blinken's formulation. And I agree with you that that is going to be challenging. I don't have the overall vision to sort of specify what the exact right balance of everything should be. The only thing that I truly believe very passionately about, and that I think I can inject here usefully, is that as we proceed in all of this, complex dimensions of this relationship, the one part that seems absolutely necessary is that both sides need to better understand each other. And the way that one does that, in my view, is primarily, and not exclusively, but primarily through education and educational exchange. So here in the US, we need to devote even more resources to studying China, have our students study the Chinese language, maybe not under Confucian institutes, which is another problem that we could segment for another discussion. But to learn more about China, to go to China, to study it, and vice versa, we need to bring Chinese students to America to learn our system. That has been an incredibly productive avenue over the last 40 years, developing since normalization of relations. And to me, all the other issues can benefit from a deeper engagement in understanding each other so that the criticisms are rooted in that sense of shared empathy.
Thank you so much for that. And that's a really important point. And it also goes to another question we had earlier from the audience about whether or not the two sides are misunderstanding each other. I mean, I believe that a lot of US-China relations problems come from inadequate communication and lack of understanding. And one of the things I've always said is that negotiations between the US and China are actually one of the best ways to get players, policymakers on each side to really learn more about the system and what constraints their counterparts in the other side are facing. And so that's why I was so glad in the Trump administration to see Robert Lighthizer undertake such an extensive discussion with his counterpart. It really did kind of change his view on the usefulness of talking to China, which should be instructive for all of us, I think. But Sheena, let me come to you for your perspective on this issue about, weighing up the balance on these different priority areas and bleeding over into different areas. I mean, what is your view on sort of how to deal with this, difficult landscape that we face with China in having so many different issues, and some where we could probably get more progress, some where we probably have less hope of getting progress, but we want to stand up in terms of our values. How do you see it?
I think given the sheer number and complexity of issues on the table, that trying to have any single sort of concept or way of dealing with every issue at all points in time across an administration is just going to be unworkable. And so I guess I think there is some value to disaggregating in as much as possible and trying to identify, is this an area really where it's about competition? And to use Ryan's formulation of competition, right? Really trying to outcompete and advance US interests by competition, not necessarily by confrontation or conflict. There are going to be areas where I think the United States is going to feel some obligation to, if not be confrontational, because I don't know exactly what policy that means, right? It's an adjective, but not a specific set of steps. But the the United States the State Department has come to this determination that there are crimes against humanity occurring in Xinjiang. I know the State Department under the Trump administration had a split memo on genocide, but that's now a determination that both administrations have decided to uphold. Right, those are areas where I think the United States may have limited power to alter the outcome. Right, to go back to Ryan's sort of critical point about setting expectations. But I think it's still very important to emphasize what the values are, and to the extent that the US can pursue or try to advance those interests, that's still worth doing, and that those interests actually probably shouldn't be linked to or necessarily traded off on other issues like climate change, right? And we saw some, kind of, I think, test suggestions in the bilateral relationship. Well, maybe you should dial this back if you want to make progress on climate change. And the administration said, no, thanks. And actually, I think that was the right call. That explicitly linking those issues and trading one for the other does not serve US interests long-term, particularly as China's interests and influence have expanded and are going to continue to expand across such a wide range of issues. So I think, we're going to have to be comfortable with this idea that the new normal is going to have a little bit higher level of disagreement over a decision that China took in the spring of 2017 that was probably driven by an internal calculus by the CCP, but that doesn't mean that the United States, the fact that we can't change that decision doesn't mean that we can't be very clear about how we view it. And I think that's something that, just as we're going to have to get used to a new normal, so will Chinese diplomats and Chinese officials. And it's good to have the healthy communication and open communication to make sure we avoid misunderstanding. And it's important to realize then where are the areas where we just don't see eye to eye, where there is a more really substantive disagreement, but also to try to keep that somewhat separate from areas where it's in our interest to be more cooperative. So I guess I see disaggregation as right now as kind of working in favor of US national interests and values alike.
Okay, Ryan, you get the last word here. We have 30 seconds. What do you think? We can mix it up and be sporty in one area and still preserve cooperation in another area. You were there in the hot seat. How do you view the practicalities of that? And how do you see this balancing act?
Well, I will be very efficient with my remarks, mindful of our time. But first, the one common thread of every problem that's been solved in the U.S. China relationship over the past 40 years is a relationship that has been built between the two officials that have custody for dealing with that issue. There are no exceptions to this rule. This is the way that things get done in the U.S. China relationship. So I think it's healthy that there is a resumption of efforts to deal directly and forthrightly with each other, not as a favor from one to the other, but just as how two mature, dispassionate major powers deal with each other. So that's the first thought. Second thought is that President Biden and President Xi have acknowledged it's possible to cooperate amidst competition. It was done as recently as 5 or 6 years ago. And if that example isn't persuasive, well, it was done during the Cold War, at the height of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So there's ample precedent for us to have a fair degree of optimism and confidence that it is possible for our two countries to find ways to cooperate with each other, even as the relationship is very tense. And the final thought I would offer is that I think that there's the most space to cooperate when neither side views it as a favor to the other, neither side considers it as a cushion for tension in other areas of the relationship, but solely when it serves both sides' interests to work together, when both parties are better off in a positive some way through working together than not doing so. And if we follow that maxim, I think we'll find that there are plenty of areas where both sides' interests would be enhanced and advanced by working together. And I think that would be healthy. But I very much agree with Sheena that cannot be done at the expense of human rights or values. That's part of who we are as Americans, and it should remain so.
I like it. The sort of the confident, cool-headed approach of sort of two major powers that need to deal with each other. Let's hope we can get there. I'm not sure we're there yet, but let's go back to Michael for our closing remarks. And thanks to all of you, and thanks to everyone who tuned in and all of the great questions that we got. Thank you.
Well, and thank you, Susan, for such a great moderating. And thank you so much to the panel for the fascinating discussion, for taking the time to talk with us today about this incredibly complex topic. We've just barely scratched the surface today. So thank you, audience, for joining us for this edition of The World Today. And we hope you'll join us again tomorrow, April 21st, for Heartbeats and Soft Power, where Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, Ambassador Andres Shimoni, and Lolita Jackson will discuss music in international diplomacy. And next Tuesday, April 27th, former U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel will discuss emerging threats and American defense policy. We're going to drop links to both of these events in the chat. As always, you can access a recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel by tomorrow, and you'll find all the great events we have planned for the next semester by joining our mailing list and following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'll drop links for all of those in the chat as well. Thank you again to the great panel. Thank you, all of you, for being here today. Stay safe. See you soon. Bye-bye, everybody.